public comment? Thank you. No request for public comment. Thank you. Any general announcements from the floor? No general announcements from the floor. I hope everyone had a chance to review July's meeting minutes. Is there any discussion on the meeting minutes?
I have one question.
Go ahead, Mike.
In the minutes, it said that we were gonna get a Q&A on the tree issue. I'm guessing we're covering that in the meeting today.
We
but-
are. So at
Okay.
6:15, you'll see a tree update. And
And that's-
so, yep.
Okay, thanks.
Originally, I think we were gonna do a written report,
Mhm.
and then we just decided that we would have Jen Cairo come back.
Got it.
Any other questions or general announcements? No, I guess we're on to the minutes, July minutes. I hope everyone had a chance to review the minutes. Were there any questions or comments on the July minutes? If not, I will entertain a motion from the floor to approve the July minutes as submitted.
So moved.
Second.
Thanks, Mike. Second from Casey, thank you. Any discussion? If not, all in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Any opposition? Motion carries, minutes are approved. And with that, we'll go to the director's report. Director Long.
Thank you, Bonnie. So the only upcoming council item that we have in August is we'll be going to council to request that they authorize a contract with Oregon Forward firm for janitorial services at park sites. Very important. It's pretty self-explanatory. They clean for us. There's a lot of absences at council in August, so it's a really light month in terms of business. I think on the agenda, Michelle included some summer free-for-all events and other events. We've got a few more weeks left, and if you haven't made it out to a movie or a music event or some other wonderful activity, I highly encourage folks visit the page and get on out there. I've been to a couple of concerts and they've been pretty amazing. Wanted to speak on the emergency response to the heat event that we went through. It was very impactful to the Bureau. So I just wanted to sort of lay out how we responded. We provided, the city provided 3 facilities to use as 24-hour emergency cooling shelters. The Portland Building, East Portland Community Center, and Charles Jordan Community Centers. We had parks carpenters and electricians help support the installation of temporary commercial portable AC units at our 2 community centers because, well, they're old and none of the HVACs were built to sustain temperatures in the hundreds. The city also provided misting station sites at Glen Haven, Harney, Mount Scott, Knott, Lentz, and also at East Portland Community Center, and drinking water filling and misting stations at Lentz, McKenna, Big Four Corners, and Lynchwood Park. The splash pads were open from 10 a.m. to 8 p.m., which is an extension of 2 hours. And that extension actually is in effect for the entire summer. So we did that preemptively, and we're very grateful that we did. A lot of people took advantage of those spaces. We had park rangers that were assigned to support the portable AC units and staff safety at cooling centers. They also did wellness support with the public, distributing cool towels and water in vulnerable areas, as well as ice packs. Oregon OSHA has new heat rules that requires mandatory breaks per hour based upon the heat index, hydration, and designated shade areas to cool down. And based on the temperatures that and the associated heat index that we reached, we activated our heat safety plan that was in effect. And of course, it affected our operations and programming. We had field staff start their days earlier. So in some cases, 5:30 in the morning, so that they could finish their work before the heat of the day really hit. All of our programming at both East Portland and Charles Jordan were canceled for the full week. And outdoor programming for recreation and land stewardship was modified or canceled depending on the heat index and staff availability. I wanted to note that the Portland Bureau of Emergency Management hired a consultant to make assessments and produce an after action report. So we'll be interviewed for that. We've also created an impact briefing that we presented to the commissioner, which will help inform our feedback. This was really, really impactful, both in terms of folks who we did not serve during the week, as well as revenue lost. So once we're further into that after action work, if anyone's interested in learning a little bit more about the impacts, we can certainly bring that back. We are endeavoring to do another employee survey. So the workforce development team is launching a Bureau employee survey in October. The last time we did a survey was in 2019. And so throughout this year, the workforce team has drafted survey content and received a lot of help, feedback from teams across the Bureau. This upcoming survey will focus on topics of safety and security, diversity, equity, inclusion, anti-racism, and employment experience, including training, professional development, and workspaces. The survey will close in early November 2022, and then the workforce team will be reporting out on findings throughout winter 2023, and then and we're also creating a small group to talk about those recommendations and how to implement them. And we will be bringing back the outcome of that survey to the Parks Board in 2023 as well. Then I wanted to speak a little bit about our Access Pass. I think I may have mentioned it at a previous board meeting, and I know it's been in our monthly report. But after a year of piloting our 2 financial assistance programs, Pay What You Can for registered activities and the Access Discount Pass for passes and drop-in admission, we're going to move forward with combining the Access Pass model for all fall activities, programs, and passes beginning October 3rd. Data from the pilot programs, post-use surveys from customers, input from staff, and a non-user community engagement survey informed the decision to move forward with this new model. The Access Pass is a single program to reduce cost as a barrier that will apply to passes, drop-in admissions, registered activities, personal training, educational preschool, and after-school programs. So one pass, the same theory, right? The same philosophy. City of Portland residents will be able to register for a free Access Pass and receive the reduced pricing up to 90% discount. The pass will be valid for 12 months from the date of enrollment. So it's a rolling enrollment as opposed to by year. The users will have the ability to opt in and self-select the depth of discount that will reduce cost as a barrier for them and their family. We will not require proof of income. And so information about this new change is going to be launched any day now, mid-August, with a promotional campaign. And we'll have very specific communications that will be designed for past users to explain the change. So just wanted to let you all know, you may not hear the word Pay What You Can for a while, but it was a really successful pilot. This will be much more streamlined. You'll be able to use the one Access Pass for all of the activities. So we're really excited about that. And then my last item is around a land acknowledgement. I know many of you and certainly staff have inquired about the status of the city's land acknowledgement. Over the last 2 years, the land acknowledgement work group, which is convened by Tribal Relations, which is a work unit within the Office of Government Relations, have been conducting a series of focus groups with the City of Portland and external partners to gain a better understanding of the kinds of resources that we need to draft and deliver a land acknowledgement statement. So they are currently contracting with the Warm Springs GeoVisions to conduct an analysis. And once they finish with the community feedback and research has been gathered and analyzed, they're going to work on developing a guidance document for city staff and language for a land acknowledgement to be used for the City of Portland. So we've had a basic moratorium on sort of doing a land acknowledgement because they don't want us working in silos. So I'm really excited about them finally getting to this point. I feel like it's been a really long time in coming, and it's definitely been a gap and something that we've been asked about multiple times. So really excited that that's moving forward. Does anyone have any questions about my report? Either this one or the one that was sent back, the monthly that was sent out? Yes.
I have a question with respect to, thank you for the report, and thank you for telling us about all the great programming. I have a question about this contract for the janitorial services.
Mhm.
I'm curious about the size of the contract and which sites they are, and how it's determined what goes to an outside vendor versus what is done by park employees.
Sure. You wanna,
Sure,
Sarah?
yeah. I'll think that second question, what's determined by an outside vendor versus park employees, I'm gonna defer to someone else, but for the moment. So we have all of our community centers being cleaned by a janitorial contractor, along with the community music center, the Multnomah Arts Center. I'd have to pull up the contract. So they're cleaning those facilities. They actually also clean our Portland Loos and the outdoor restrooms, but that's off of a separate contract. It is currently, we're looking at, sorry if I'm not remembering your whole question, but about
The
a
amount.
year. Oh, the amount. So for about a year of service, it's about $1.2 million. And so we're looking at starting with 1 year, we might go to 5 years, which if you do the math with, additions for cost of living, it's roughly about 7.5 million for 5 years. And we are specifically working with a qualified rehabilitation firm. So that's a state program. It's now called the Oregon Forward Program. Thank you. Formerly QRF, and they specifically hire folks with barriers to employment. So it's a really, great program. And so we're able to just direct contract with those folks. So that's who we'll be working with. They're called Northwest Success.
And in terms of what we choose, I think it has mostly to do with capacity. And this is certainly labor is brought into the conversation. So the contract, definitely gets vetted by labor management.
Yeah, thank you. I just, but I think it's great that they're hiring folks who had previous barriers to employment. I just wanted to make sure that it wasn't a situation, you often have situations where going to an outside vendor can be a cost-cutting measure that has its own challenges. So I wanted to just hear about that.
Yeah, for sure.
Any other questions? Oh, no.
So the pay-as-you-go or pay-as-you-can and that access pass, just real briefly, how much did that increase use? Just some basics about what you know about it and maybe.
Yeah, I don't really have the data in front of
Okay.
me, but maybe Maximo, do you have any sort of off the top of your head data that you can share regarding pay as you can, pay what you can? Now you got me saying it wrong. Pay what you can in terms of usership. And
Yeah, I don't have a deep dive data. I do know in the past, I believe it was about 5% of our overall for just registered programs. ACT was accessing our scholarship program in the past and having a sliding scale going up to 90% for the access discount as well as the pay what you can for our pilots. We were accessing about 19% of registrations. We're utilizing those in some capacity. So we've seen more usage based on its access and availability.
Hey, Maximo, I know your team pulled this together, so I've got the numbers here real quick.
yeah, and I was also going to say that Jamie's going to come in October to present
Yeah.
this entire,
Okay.
we have a report, but go ahead.
Yeah, so there's a levy report coming out in October, so we're in the process of pulling up that all together. So this is for last fiscal year. So the first year of the levy, we provided $1.1 million of financial assistance to 7,948 unique users. And so that number is lower. Actually, we can talk more about this if we want. It's because of COVID restricted programming, so we had less registrations. For instance, that summer versus this summer, we were able to have twice as many people in a camp this summer because of the COVID restrictions of how many teachers or guides to every camper. And then we just had more scale. So just scale wise, without even additional research, those numbers are much bigger going forward.
And after this meeting, I was gonna send out the report, so y'all have some time to digest it, and then we're having, did I say October? Is it September or October? That Jamie's coming. September, next month.
Yeah.
Jamie will be here, Jamie Sandness, and so if you have any questions, you'll have a nice amount of time to sort of digest the information between now and the next meeting.
Thank you. It looks like Alana has a question.
Yeah, thanks. I'm just wondering, as you are looking at the impacts of shutting down services during the heat wave, especially in those community centers where all services were shut down because the community center was used as a cooling center, are you able to take into account people who would have otherwise accessed program but may not have been able to access the cooling center and might have actually been worse off in the heat because of it? I'm thinking specifically about like kids who were signed up for camps who then were either at home alone because parents still had to work, or at home with parents, potentially not in cooled settings because parents were trying to work from home with kids. Or is that not something that you'll be able to consider as you're looking at the data that you have?
No, it's actually exactly the data that we've collected. So we know exactly how many programs and the registered capacity for each of those. And so we've identified how many users were impacted, how many potential visits were lost. So we have actually all of that information. That'll be a part of our impact statement when we do this after action report with this consultant. So it's very important to me that we both quantify and qualify all of the impacts, because there are a lot of impacts also around work that wasn't done in order to support the cooling centers. And it's not that we, we understand that our community centers would have served that same purpose for folks cooling throughout the day. It was the 24 hours for 6 days straight that really was impactful. Whereas, just opening your doors to all of the community to use the space as a cooling space and not doing it overnight, we would have served thousands of people each day, as opposed to, honestly, it was no more than 75, maybe 90.
Our low was about 70 and our high was 190 in a day.
Yeah.
Over the 60 period.
So, yes, we're looking at all of that. Erin?
I'm just curious, like continuing on that, where does, you're looking at that, what does that conversation look like? Like who is involved in it and where do you go when you look at that?
Yeah, so the Portland Bureau of Emergency Management has brought on a consultant, a third party, to look at the full emergency response. So not just PBEM, but also the county, because we work with the county. And the county is actually technically in lead when there's an emergency like that. So presumably all that information will be shared with the county and council members. There is a deficiency in terms of both the lack of activation of homeless shelters for cooling, in terms of them opening their doors to beyond their regular guests. There's a lack of cooperation and availability of public school spaces. There are untold amounts of office buildings that are empty in the downtown core. Large retail operations that have gone under in Outer East. There are just way too many potential resources out there that are not being investigated. And for us to be 2 out of 3 city facilities that support cooling and then displace the very community that we're hoping to serve is just it's counterintuitive. And so that's the message we're bringing forward. It's not that we don't want to be a part of the solution. We're just afraid they're not looking deep enough to find other solutions. And this is no longer emergencies. Like I really regret that they continue to use the word emergency. This is climate change is here. Our expectations need to shift, and we need to be having these conversations year round. Because we'll probably have this conversation this winter when, we get a foot of snow and life screeches to a halt and they ask us to open up warming shelters. So, we'll continue to circle back with you all. If there's an opportunity to provide some feedback, or if y'all want to advocate in any way, we can certainly have that conversation as well.
Yeah, I just want to add, I think it's a really important topic. It seems like that would be a good topic for the board. I know we don't have enough time right now but to have maybe a little bit more of a robust conversation around, and then think about as a board, is this something that we want to talk about advocating on, just like you're saying? But I think if we would need to be provided more information and have a conversation as a board on the topic. But it does seem like a really important thing for the board to think about. And just like you're saying with what's going to happen in winter and what's going to happen in years to come, because this is our reality now. So.
Yeah. Well, I don't think the topic is, I think it'll continue to be relevant. So we can certainly revisit it. I'll ask Sarah to put it in our parking lot for topics to bring to y'all. And assuming that after action report becomes public information at some point, happy to share that as well. Sabrina?
Hi, apologies if this was already asked. I have a little one running around, so sometimes I'm in and out, but did you talk about who is utilizing these cooling shelters in relation to, I don't know, who typically uses the community centers, for example? I've just heard about the warming shelters and who typically is there, meaning they're not really families and they're pretty homogeneous who is utilizing those spaces. Do you have any anecdote, anything around who's utilizing these services?
Yeah. I can say anecdotally, I visited several different times, so I can just tell you what I saw. It was mostly singular people, mostly men, and in some cases, families or couples, but mostly single men. And from the looks of it, mostly houseless individuals. Although during the day, sometimes there were folks who arrived in cars or walked and spent a few hours and then left, right? They were not staying there for long periods of time.
Thanks. That's pretty much what I heard about the warming shelters as well. And I guess my point is I'm wondering, and maybe this was already said again, I apologize if I'm repeating stuff, but for those who are utilizing community centers, which is a really broad range of people, what do families or people with young children do, knowing that, that's the population that's there. And, I don't know if becomes a family-friendly environment. I think that needs to be taken into consideration. Where do families go, especially in Outer East Portland, who are in older buildings and don't have ACs? Do you all have the autonomy to create that environment?
Well, that's certainly something that we're working towards, right? Yeah. We're being told to do this work, and so that's the reason why we're documenting the impacts, elevating the impacts, and having conversations. Because, like I said, this work meant that we displaced precisely the people who needed cooling opportunities the most, and more of them, right? Just based on the amount of folks that we would have serviced based on our programming, our registered activities. So yes, Sabrina, we're definitely aware of that, and that's a part of the conversation for sure.
Yeah, thank you. I definitely, to Aaron's point, would love to stay involved in that and see how, I can be of support, because Rosewood, we have a community center, and I know that, government has resources, but me personally, I worry about, okay, what would it mean if now we're a, official cooling shelter? Do we lose our autonomy of, being able to serve the community we want to serve? So anyways, I appreciate that. Thank you.
Corbin?
Thank you. Can you hear me okay? Because I was having some mic problems. I think we should shy away about who needs it the most and understand that those who don't have air conditioning, that are susceptible to heat illnesses or burdens, all need it, and not create a hierarchy who needs it the most. So one thing that I would like to see in the report is, how are these particular cooling centers configured, and the scheduling around programming, the normal programming that would be happening during that day. Because it sounds like that once it becomes a cooling shelter, all programming that day shuts down.
So there's
For the
two
cool
different,
is that
yeah.
how it, I would like to understand the situation a little bit more.
so I'll just say one thing, and then I'll say that the report is nothing that we're creating, but we will provide them with the impacts. So we know exactly how many programs did not happen because our centers were used as shelters. So there are cooling spaces, which are things like lobby buildings and libraries. There are cooling centers, which are rec centers or community centers that are open during the day for other activities, but you can come in and cool off during the day. And then there's cooling shelters, which means they're open, that it's a 24-hour operation. So that's how they're sort of classifying the three different levels. But like to your question, we will provide the information that we have around our operation to this consultant. They are producing the report, but it will include the recreation and programmatic impacts for sure. And I will say that generally they're using, we only allow them to use spaces like gyms and the lobby and the bathrooms. We close off smaller multi-purpose rooms, kitchens, offices, the pools, the fitness rooms. So it's pretty much contained in large spaces, and then spaces to get to the restrooms.
Thank you, because it sounds like the whole thing is shutting down. And so any information that you can give us would be helpful in the conversation.
Yeah, I think Dr. Corbin, to your point, we've had a history of being able to provide warming spaces and cooling spaces over the decades. Like that's just what we do as community centers. However, the way it seems to be managed now, they take over the facility for a 24-hour shelter access, then they're really taking over the whole site.
Yeah, I understand that now. So I appreciate it. Thank you.
Right.
Thank you. Any other questions for Director Long related to her report, or other questions? Okay, if not, we'll move to the working group reports. We'll start with Board Affairs. Casey.
Thank you, Mike. I'm not going to go over what I submitted in writing, just to say that we are working on the mission for our draft mission for the board. Hopefully, we'll work through it on the next meeting. And we're also working on the potential for having additional working groups to cover different programming. If anyone has any questions or comments or want to tell me what they want, feel free to give me a contact. Also, I just want to remind everybody, earlier this month, I sent out an email asking for memberships in board-related activities that you're active in. I've received some responses, and for those, I thank you. But if you haven't responded to me yet, I'd really appreciate you doing that, so I don't have to bug you later. That's it, unless any other member of the Board Affairs Working Group has any other contribution, or if anybody has any questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Casey. Any, let's see, land use and infrastructure. David. David's trying to unmute.
Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Okay, awesome. Yeah, I'm called in, so it's a different mute button here. Hi, everybody. Let's see, we had updates on 3 separate projects. We had an update on the Burnside Bridge Earthquake Ready project, specifically maybe more about the ramping for that. We had a little bit of an update on the I-5 bridge replacement and on the regional trail grant update. And then I'll start with the Burnside Bridge project. That was really focused around all the different ramp alternatives that are being studied for bringing access from the Burnside Bridge down to the East Bank Esplanade. And I think that there's 4 really interesting options out there, and they're looking at the pros and cons of each one of those. They still need to get those options in front of kind of pedestrian and bicycle advisory committees to make sure that they're solving all the issues and providing all the access that they need to. So that's kind of interesting to watch those moving forward, but the design is just still progressing, so that's in progress. For the I-5 bridge updates, there was some exciting news that both states have kind of reached some agreements on this, so it's moving forward. It's not stalling like we've seen in previous iterations of this, so that's great that the states are coming together to see this thing forward. One interesting aspect of this is there could be a new park on Hayden Island that's a part of this, so I think that's something that we want to track as that design moves forward. Right now, it's really just the big idea that something could happen there, but there's no specifics to where, how big, or really what would that be. So I think we'll keep tracking that one along. And then on the regional trail grant front, it looks like there are 3 trail grants that will be funded. So that was good news that those are moving forward. And let's see if I have the notes for those. 2 segments of Kelly Point Park and a connection from Columbia Park to Cathedral Park. And then there was additional funding asked for an additional bridge crossing of Columbia Boulevard, I think. So those are kind of exciting to see those regional trail grants moving forward. We were hoping to get an update on the Friends of Trees piece, but I think someone from the Urban Forestry was not available at short notice to kind of help us with that, because I know that came up at last meeting. So we're hopefully going to have a representative from the Urban Forestry to come in and give us an update on that next time. And we also want to check in with Tanya Booker on the stewardship issue at our next meeting. So we want to see how the stewardship and daily maintenance is being taken care of, or if there's challenges with that we could be abreast of that. And then lastly, I apologize for missing last month's meeting, and you guys got that great update from OMSI. I did receive a response back from OMSI on some of the questions that the group asked during that presentation. And Bonnie, I guess I just needed to ask, what's the best way to distribute that information to the rest of the board?
Yeah, I think probably just you can send it directly out to the board, either through Michelle in a packet, or you can send it directly.
Okay, thank you. So that was it. It was a pretty informative meeting. Anyone else on the group that wants to add something that I glanced over?
Thanks, David. One thing I just wanted to mention is the tree update that you mentioned. We actually are going to have a brief tree update in the full board meeting since we ran out of time last time. But yes, in terms of if the land use infrastructure working group can continue tracking that, that'd be terrific. I'll also mention, I thought that the other exciting thing about the I-5 bridge to me, in addition to the potential new park, was the fact that they have a proposed multi-use path that will head up north to our friends to the north, which is intended to be much more accessible than the one on the Glenn Jackson Bridge. So I think that that's really exciting. Any other, Paul, looks like you might have something to add as well. Go ahead, Paul.
Thanks, Bonnie. There was one other thing that I wanted to add to David's report, which is there's a proposed PGE power line through Forest Park, and we're going to get an update on that in the near future.
Thanks, Paul. Any other additions from any other members of the Land Use and Infrastructure Working Group? If not, any questions from the floor from anybody else? Thank you, David. With that, we'll go to financial sustainability. Mike.
Yeah, I don't have much. So we did get final numbers on the fiscal year that ended June 30th. And they're very close to what I said in the last meeting. I think for the general fund expense appropriation, they came in about $22 million under budget. And big picture, that essentially that amount's going to roll over into the next year as part of the levy fund appropriation. As it relates to the budget, that's process is going underway right now for the 2023 to 2024 fiscal year. The deadline for the department managers to submit their project proposals has passed. I think they got about 36 project proposals that'll be reviewed. So far, they're just very high level. Health, as I think I said last month, that Healthy Parks, Healthy Portland's work is going to inform the priorities. The document that went out with the packet has a list of what those priorities are, so I won't go through the rather extensive list. And then in our last working group meeting, Sarah gave us an overview of the sustainable future work that's going on, especially as it relates to the ballot initiative task force. And they've met twice already, and she's got a presentation for us, so I don't want to steal her thunder, so I'm just going to leave it at that. And that's basically it. It's pretty light stuff this time. Any questions?
Thanks, Mike.
No?
Anything anyone wants to add? Members of the Financial Sustainability Work Group, or any questions from the floor? If not, we'll go to Community Engagement Work Group. Karen.
Thank you, Bonnie. So as everyone knows, we've kind of completed 2 projects. The first is changing the board time to 5 to 7 and also updating our public comment process. Now that we've accomplished those, we're looking at what are our objectives for this year as a group, and then what are some of the tactics that we, or like concrete things that we want to do to help meet those objectives. So some of the objectives that we have identified is, the first is really board visibility, and I know this has been a priority of the board over several years. I don't think that the majority of the community, or even the minority of the community, really understands that the board exists. And so that's one of our big objectives, is to get that information out there. The other is kind of organizing a process for community engagement in terms of the board. And then also as a group, as a working group, learning more about community groups, friends of groups, and different community-based organizations that intersect and interact with PPR. So those are some of our objectives. In terms of tactics, some of the things that we have identified that we want to accomplish are, one is just creating an external handout that Parks board members can use when we're doing our own community engagement, but also maybe that can be accessible at recreation centers or different park related events, something that people have that can explain what the board is, about the public comment time, and give some general information to community members. The second is to create an internal kind of informational, like an internal handout, something that we can have that's informational, or talking points that board members can have as you're out there in community, or I'm sure all of us have had instances where people in our lives it would be helpful to have some talking points about what the board does, what our role is, something like that we can have, and also that new board members can have when they're learning about talking about their role on the board. So that's another kind of tactic or concrete thing that we're looking at doing this year. Besides that, we're also interested in, just as a board and as a working group, understanding the different parks groups and recreation centers. I think that's something that when you join the board, there's so many different avenues that parks interacts with the community. So having maybe a reference point for us to orient ourselves around would be helpful. And then I also identifying kind of what groups we're interested in doing outreach as a community working group, or as a board too, whether it's community-based organizations, friends groups, other types of partner organizations, to kind of, again, increase our board visibility and awareness that this board exists, and that there's opportunity for engagement with parks and with the kind of government through this board. So that's some of the things. The other things that are on our plate, I didn't put it in the update, but just so people are aware, one of the things is to actually produce some internal guidelines around public comment. So right now we have the external guidelines, but we'd also like some internal guidelines to make sure that when members of the public come to provide comment to us, there's a follow through and kind of what's our internal process for dealing with public comment. That's still on our kind of to-do list. The other thing is we're at some point want to talk as a working group. We have ex officio positions open right now. So as a working group, we'd like to kind of brainstorm some different options for who might be good groups or connections for us to have to fill those ex officio seats. So that's my update. Happy to answer any questions or comments.
Thanks, Erin. Anything from anybody else on the community engagement working group or any questions from the floor? Those sound like great resources that have been will be really useful. So with that, that's the end of the work group reports, but we have two special reports. Corbin, who serves on the A Park and Wilson Pool Renaming Committee. Corbin.
Thank you, Bonnie. I hope everybody can hear me okay. So a naming committee for A Wilson Park, formerly known as Custard Park, and Wilson Pool has been formed, and I have attended one meeting that took place on June 28th via Zoom, and I believe we're going to have 3 meetings altogether. We're currently in the process of receiving submissions for the renamings, and as of August 3rd, 70 plus submissions have been received. We are seeking names that reflect and inspire the community, honor Native and Indigenous communities, are symbolic or significant, create a sense of community and inclusion, and are future facing and imagine a Portland for all. So that's the criteria. Also, policy states that naming a park or a facility after an outstanding person is allowed posthumously at least 3 years after they have passed away. So the submissions are going to be closing on Monday, August 22nd, and I'm about to post the link in our chat. Do that really quickly. And so everybody here has access to it now. And all this information can be found on the City of Portland Parks and Recreation site, which has the overview, the committee members, everything is located there, along with the survey if you want to participate. And the naming committee will be conducting a site visit at the end of the month. And we are in the process of scheduling our second meeting in September. So that's my report for you.
Thank you, Corbin. Any questions? I see a question from Casey.
I have one. I don't know if it's for you, Corbin, or it's for Director Long. I'm curious to know if this group is really serving as a beta test for a broader look at names and how they'll be approached. No, totally different. Okay.
No, they're just working on those 2 particular sites.
Okay.
Yeah.
Any other questions for Corbin? Or with that, Parks Levy Oversight Committee, Paul. Thank you, Corbin.
The Tax Levy Oversight Committee has met twice now, and there'll be a 3rd meeting coming up in September. We've had really good presentations from city staff. We've looked at a variety of options, from large funding mechanisms of roughly $80 to $110 million a year to smaller $5 to $10 million a year, ranging from food and beverage tax to special district to high income tax to payroll tax. And no decisions or leanings have been described so far. I think there's going to be more updates from Sarah, but I think it's going to be interesting to see where we land as a committee. It's a diverse group, and there's been some good question and answer on the group so far.
Yeah.
Paul, I just wanted to clarify. I think you're describing the ballot initiative task force.
Yes.
And just to clarify, so the Parks Levy Oversight Committee.
Oh,
is
sorry.
different met 3 times and we're about to have your 4th meeting, also in September though.
Yeah. Sorry, I'm a little bit distracted because we're getting ready to leave on vacation tomorrow. So sorry.
I just wanted to make sure everyone understood those are 2 separate groups.
Yes, they are two separate groups. Um,
Would you like to report on the other committee?
Parks Levy Oversight Committee, for some reason, I got those mixed up and I looked at the agenda. And so what could I tell you off the top of my head? I think Sarah captured it well. And if you have questions, I'd be happy to answer them later. But unfortunately, I came misprepared for this presentation tonight.
And we'll have the draft first year levy report for the next meeting for the levy oversight committee, and then they'll go through a process to have their own report to go along with that to council in October.
Thank you for the clarification, Sarah and Todd. Thank you, Paul. Any other questions? If not, we'll move on to the Parks Foundation report. Randy, are you going to tell us how awesome Paseo was? Because it was super fun.
Oh, good. So many people who told me that they went and I didn't see them. It's such a funny space that way. It's so spread out. And to that end, I don't have any real concrete numbers around how many people came because we didn't have any control points. But an interesting measure is the Portland Art Museum had its Family Free Day on Saturday, and it only had, the only special exhibition was the perspectives on, 5 BIPOC photographers on the protests. So, not a, blockbuster exhibition, but they got blockbuster attendance that day. So it was a nice alignment between, their programming and our festival. But it was, I think it came off really well. It was the first time we'd done anything of that scale. And, we supported in one way or another over 100 artists, vendors. We had numerous outdoors and health and parks oriented groups tabling there, and we supported all of them. One of my prouder, I guess, stats is that we only had to ask 2 people to leave. And I spent a lot of time on the park blocks. I was installing some poetry banners for a kind of walkthrough poem, and I really learned who hangs out on the park blocks, and we really worked hard to make sure people who do hang out there felt welcomed. We did a lot of work in advance in terms of handing out food and water and letting people know what we were doing and that they were welcome to be with us, and lots of the folks that I met and observed there did come to the festival, and it was really awesome to just sort of see everybody kind of all mixed together. For those of you who didn't make it, we had 3 stages, one through our partnership with Portland Art Museum at Madison Avenue that was primarily music, and then we had an indigenous space. We basically kind of gave the keys to curator Amanda Stubitz, who's part of the Native community, and she put together incredible programming and brought elders and just a great diversity of programming within that community there, and it was really popular. And then at Director Park, it was some music, but mostly performing arts and all kinds of different folks. I learned a whole bunch of stuff about dance forms I didn't even know about. And so it was, I think, overall, a success. I mean, it, sometimes felt lightly attended, but, for me, and I think the foundation and those involved, we had a big, steering committee, and, everybody really felt good about it. Our surveys, since then have all been, extremely positive. But I think the most important thing is that we took the idea of a downtown festival, took it apart piece by piece, put the equity lens on every aspect of it, everybody we hired, how we invited people to show up, how we treated them, how we produced the thing. We had Friends of Noise doing all the stage production, so youth music organization, just every aspect of it, we really tried to, basically walk our talk on and then put it back together, and it was, pretty successful. So I'm quite proud of it. And thanks to those of you who came, and we'll see what happens, how it fits into the wider priorities of the foundation. My only other thing is we have a retreat coming up September 30th, where we'll be looking, at the larger picture of the foundation. We've spent 3 years, like everybody else, pivoting and figuring out ways to stay visible and things and ways to be useful. Had some things that we wanted to do that we couldn't do, and we'd like to think that we're at least to a point that we could start thinking strategically rather than tactically. So I'm looking forward to that conversation, and the board is too. So I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thanks, Randy. Any questions for Randy?
Thanks, everybody.
Okay, with that, we'll move to the tree update continuation. Basically, we didn't have really any time to get into questions here. So Jen, I don't know if you want to give a quick, 2-minute summary of all the stuff that you said last time over 20 minutes, but to warm people up, because I know that people had questions and they might not have them front of mind.
I actually, we transcribed the questions, so I'm happy to sort of paraphrase the 3 remaining questions that we didn't quite get into, if that's okay with everyone.
That sounds great.
All right, so one of the questions came from Erin, and she expressed her thoughts about the Friends of Tree work, as she's been a volunteer for many years. But her question of substance was, why couldn't we transfer the BES contract over to Parks? That was the question among the comments.
Thank you, Director Long. Hello, Parks Board. And the response to that question among the comments was that Parks and Bureau of Environmental Services, who had that contract with Friends of Trees, have negotiated tree planting responsibilities and resources for some years now. We're working now on completing an intergovernmental agreement, and funding is part of that conversation. Once that agreement is in place, we'll be happy to share details with the Parks Board and our tree planting partners in the community.
Erin?
I'm not sure I understood. Sorry, I'm not sure I understood that. So can you say that in maybe a little just more plain language?
We are working, so the contract with BES was a separate contract from the ones that Urban Forestry and Parks hold with Friends of Trees. And those contracts are determined according to procurement rules and other things by the city. So we can't really just move a contract, and funding, of course, would go with it. And that's BES's jurisdiction for their contracts. But getting to the bigger picture and the longer sweep of where we're headed, we in Parks continue to work with BES around tree planting responsibilities and resources. We've been doing that for some years now, and you all have heard about that, and Bonnie's been involved in some of it directly. Right now, we're working on completing an agreement between the 2 bureaus, a written agreement. Funding is part of that conversation. And once we have that in place with BES, we'll be happy to share any details of it with you all at the Parks Board and other folks.
Oh, so just so I'm clear on that, because my understanding was that you were taking tree planting under urban forestry. So are you saying there's still an avenue for BES to be engaged in street tree planting, or is this something else?
BES is currently focused on certain private property tree planting. Parks is focused on street tree planting.
Yes, but the contract with Friends of Trees under BES was street tree planting, correct?
The contract with BES included street tree planting. I think that was its primary purpose
Right.
at the time. Yeah.
So when what you're talking about right now is not right. So it's still the case that street tree planting, BES will not be operating street tree planting with the contractor Friends of Trees anymore.
That's right, Erin. Instead, Parks is operating street tree planting, and that continues to include Friends of Trees under parks contracts currently.
I have a question that maybe clarifies. So what's the goal of the intergovernmental agreement?
Right, thank you, whoever that was, I can't see. who
That was Adrian.
Oh, Adrian, thank you. The goal of the intergovernmental agreement is really to clarify what the roles and responsibilities between the two bureaus are and to articulate how the two bureaus will work together to promote tree planting in the city. And communication between the bureaus, and these have been issues in the past that our processes, of which there have been 2 formal processes, have explored, and this was one of the outcomes of those processes, is to have a written agreement about who does what, basically. And that's what we're working on now.
And the second question that we recorded from the last meeting was also from Adrian, and she asked if the Bureau is capable of doing what Friends of Trees was doing, I guess, in the interim.
Okay, and Friends of Trees reported planting around 1,000 to 1,500 street trees through their BES partnership, through their contract with BES. Parks and Rec will match that street tree planting volume through various funding sources and programs in 2023. In addition, Parks is continuing to work with neighbors and volunteers to help build the community's understanding and relationship with their urban forest. That's one part of what Parks is doing. We also have other programs that are about expanding canopy as well.
So I have a follow-up. Can I ask a follow-up question?
Yeah, and then Mike has his hand up. and
Oh,
then-
I'm sorry, Mike. Yeah.
Erin, you're fine. Go
If
ahead.
it's a follow-up, go ahead, Erin.
Oh, okay, yeah, it is a follow-up question. I have a few. So a few of the things that Friends of Trees does, one is has community, well, one is they offer watering services. I know I look around and see young trees dying because of lack of watering. Is that something that urban forestry will do? And then also the other thing is engaging community volunteers to do kind of, I don't know what Friends of Trees calls it. And by the way, I want to clarify, I'm not a longtime volunteer with Friends of Trees. I volunteered as a child with Friends of Trees. I have not been an adult volunteer. It was my first volunteer experience. I haven't had other engagement besides we do have a street tree from Friends of Trees that we got several years ago. But the other thing that I know that they're engaged in is doing kind of volunteer wellness checks on the trees that are planted for the first few years. Is that something that urban forestry will be doing as well? And it does sound like there's a gap in 2022 because of the loss of contract. So if you could confirm that as well. Thank you.
You might have to remind me, Erin, what all that was, but what I heard was planting, and our contracts require 3 years of establishment care, including watering. Those were not required by the program that Friends of Trees was contracted for with BES. Volunteer care, we have several programs that focus on volunteer engagement and community ownership and stewardship of trees. Some of those include planting. That's not the current street tree planting program. That current program is what we call an opt-out model, and it's focused really in low income and low canopy parts of the city. And it also involves some sites that can be difficult with an opt-out model for volunteers to have to navigate. And there are also some safety concerns around some of those sites too. For example, we do some with ODOT right of way. And your other question was about the volume of trees planted, I think.
Well,
Is
I
that
think
right?
because Adrian's question was about if there would be a loss, and you mentioned 2023, but you didn't mention 2022, which is the year that we're currently in.
Right, we are continuing to ramp up the street tree program. And we are also doing yard tree giveaway as part of what we consider a comprehensive planting program, as well as learning landscapes and other local, like neighborhood tree team planting efforts, which are much smaller, as well as park tree planting. So if we're looking at a 1-for-1 right now of how many trees Friends of Trees was reported planting under their BES contract and what Parks is doing right now with just street tree opt-out, it is not as high as that, but it will be in 2023. Our funding just began, Erin, in 2015 when the tree code was implemented. It started at 0. we had to accumulate funds in order to have any resources to plant with. Urban forestry has not had planting resources prior to the tree mitigation fund. And we opted to work with community in the first 2 years to develop growing a more equitable urban forest, which is the city's strategic tree planting plan. And we're following that plan. So literally we've had to wait to acquire enough funds to expand our program. We're still working on that. We would have planted a lot more by now had we had more resources. That's why part of our conversation with BES ongoing is about resources and whether those will be included in a written agreement between the bureaus.
Thank you. Mike, then Sabrina, then Alejandro.
So I've got a kind of a basic bottom line question, but I think it might be important for messaging. At the end of the day, are paid employees going to be doing the work that was being done by volunteers previously?
No contractors are doing the opt-out street tree planting. There are paid staff involved. However, they are not doing the planting. That would be comparable to running a volunteer program. And then, of course, we do have other programs that involve volunteer tree care and planting. They are not on the scale of what the BES contract with Friends of Trees did with volunteers for street trees.
Thank you.
Mike, Sabrina.
I might be one of the few who's not super well versed in trees and all of this, but I'm trying to kind of follow this and understand. So with the street trees, going over to parks, does that mean that urban forestry is looking to hire more people? Like, is it going to grow the program, or is it just saying that parks or urban forestry is going to now contract with someone new to do the work? And if you can answer as like elementary as possible, because again,
Okay.
I don't have a huge baseline of trees and all of that.
Sure. Thanks for the question, Sabrina. First, Parks Urban Forestry has always done street trees. It's literally required by code that anyone planting street trees or doing other things with street trees get permits from Urban Forestry to do that. And we set all the standards and requirements around those as is appropriate for the forest managers. So what we're talking about is BES had a permit to do street tree planting with which they had contractors doing the work. One of those was Friends of Trees. And tell me the other part of your question.
Well, I'm just wondering now that what you just described, I guess, is not happening. Is urban forestry going to be growing, hiring people to now do that work?
Thanks. Been a long day and I didn't write that down. So sorry. Thanks for repeating it. We are working on, as I said earlier, trying to identify increased funds and expand in all types of planting. Right. And that means, yes, we will be staffing up. We will not be really staffing up to physically plant trees as the previous person asked, rather to create and run programs for others to plant trees. And those will be contractors as well as potentially more volunteer planting opportunities. And that's all reliant on levy funding and if any other funding sources can be identified to do that work.
And if I could just ask one more follow-up, and you said that in your talks with BES, a part of it is looking to see if BES is going to give some funds to you all for doing all this type of management. Is that what I heard?
Yes, that is something that's being discussed.
Thank you. Alejandro, are you passing in on your question?
No, I'm sorry, just accidentally lower my hand. On the Jen, thanks for all the information on the decision of working with contractors in the future. I guess I'm curious about whether there would be that would go through kind of like the normal or regular procurement process, and
Great,
and if
thanks.
so, is that something that somehow affected the decision of not working with Friends of Trees again?
Well, we are still, Alejandro, working with Friends of Trees. They still have contracts with Urban Forestry. So the contract that stopped was with another bureau. And the city has particular contracting requirements, how things are done with a whole other bureau actually runs that. The contracts that we have currently in Urban Forestry will be expiring. So we're working on creating new requests for proposals, they're called. They're basically like an advertisement with information in it that goes out and asks folks to apply and submit how they might become contractors. One of our goals in doing that, regardless of what the city requirements are trying to make the RFP as broad and accessible to as many different organizations as possible. That could be Friends of Trees, it could be others. What the city's noticed in its past contracting practices, and you all as park board members may have heard of this before, so I'm sorry if I'm repeating, but historically, a lot of those lucrative contracting opportunities have gone to well-established organizations and companies, and have been really hard for small or different organizations to get a chance at. So we're trying to find ways to make them more broadly accessible. And again, our goal is ultimately we get good partnerships in place, and that those potentially include BIPOC-owned companies, women-owned companies, or organizations that may have not had that opportunity in the past, as well as folks who had planted before.
But that is, just to be clear, Jen, that's on a city level, or that's on a bureau level that you're making those decisions?
The city is pursuing broader contract provisions. And for trees, which is a specific part of overall contracting, so it's a little different than, for example, contracting to build play structures in parks. We also are trying to find the specific ways to reduce those barriers.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Alejandro. Ilana.
Thanks. And thanks, Jen, for that last comment. When I first heard about the contract change, my assumption was that that might be part of this shift to try to expand contracting opportunities. And I appreciate you flagging that that could be some of what's going on here as the board tries to understand the blowback that we're hearing. I just wanted to ask a point of clarification. Somebody asked if this change meant that work that was formerly done by volunteers would now be done by staff, and you said no, it would be done by contractors. Does that mean that there is going to be a shift from volunteer work to paid work through contractors, and potentially an increase in cost? Or will there not be an increase in cost because you expect contracts to be to have less overhead? Or is it that we will still have contractors overseeing the work, but you expect the same amount to be done by volunteers, so there won't be any increase in cost?
Well, as per cost, we'd have to get information on how those stack up. I don't have that in mind. We are always trying to get the most out of the people's money that we can. And that is why we started with the programs that we have currently, the big ones, Yard Tree Giveaway and Opt-out Street Tree Planting. So I can't answer that specifically. We'll have to get back to you on that. But as the forest managers, we're really looking at tree planting as a very large unmet outstanding need that needs to occur in many places in many different ways by just about everyone. And so we currently have volunteers planting, as well as contractors, as well as staff. And the way we're looking at it is trying to be strategic about where are the best opportunities and the best outcomes we can get through whichever means possible. So we're still working on that now. And what I can say kind of definitively is you'll see all three of those versions continue in some form in the future. So paid staff, contractors, and volunteers. Right now, most of it is most of the volume is by property owners who are picking up trees, and we help them plant them if they need our help and give instruction, and also contractors with the street tree planting that's going on right now.
Thank you. Last question, Ally.
Yeah, just, my understanding is that the contract loss from Friends of Trees was a giant financial hit, right? It made up a really big percentage of their annual revenue for the organization. I understand moving to a different model. Was there any conversation about staggering that blow to give them time to be able to look at other sources of revenue or figure out different models? Just it's a giant hit. So I'm wondering how that factored in.
Yeah, a good question, Ally. In fact, BES extended their contract with Friends of Trees, after it had technically expired, which is something we can do and generally consider at least doing. My understanding is that was to help bridge that gap, literally. And we'll have to get exact dates for you, but I think that was a year's time.
It was a year. Yeah, it was a year. It was extended by a year.
Thank you. Yeah, so indeed what you asked about, BES did attempt to do that.
Great.
Sorry,
Let's move
Erin, I'm moving on. But this will continue, the land use and infrastructure group is gonna continue tracking this so that, because we do consider trees part of our infrastructure. So with that, we're gonna move to the sustainable future update. Sarah.
Thanks, Bonnie.
Great. So I'm actually gonna start, and I think Michelle's gonna start we have some slides, so you're doing it? All right, fabulous. I'm confused. So as you all know, based on the direction we received from our city council back in 2019, we continue to pursue additional funding options to sustain and fulfill our service levels and avoid reducing or scaling back critical park services for our community to fit within only the resources that we actually have today. I'm committed to providing city council and voters with opportunities to fund the service levels they've told us they want to see. Referral of the voter-approved 5-year parks levy on the November 2020 ballot allowed the Bureau to avoid devastating service cuts and make progress on operating services. But it's only a temporary funding solution, as we all know, and it did not solve all of our long-term ongoing financial needs. That's why we're continuing ways to look forward and looking at potential ballot initiatives. So today, Sarah Huggins is with us, and she's going to present an update on our sustainable future work. So Sarah, take it away.
Thanks, Director Long. So this presentation is going to provide an update on our work with the Ballot Initiative Task Force and a little bit of an update on our Sustainable Future Program work to date. Also go over our current funding position and our funding gaps. And then if we have additional time, which it looks to me like we might on the agenda. So if the time is there, I'd love to get your feedback on some criteria that we could consider as we look at the funding options, and also see if you have suggestions for other funding options that we could be looking at. So I want to go over a little bit what we've asked of this Ballot Initiative Task Force. It's a limited duration, limited scope Portland Parks Advisory Group that is being asked to review alternative funding options for the Parks Bureau to support a financially sustainable park system, and also to provide advice and consultation to Director Long on the alternative funding options and the sequencing of potential future ballot initiatives, which Director Long could then consider in collaboration and coordination with Parks Commissioner Rubio. This task force is one way that we're getting input. It's not the only way. So we have had, and we're going to continue to have broader conversations with the community, with you all today, and hopefully in the future as well, and other Parks Advisory Boards about our funding position and our funding needs as well. This slide shows kind of the outline of the 3 meetings of the Ballot Initiative Task Force. So meetings 1 and 2 have occurred, as Paul mentioned earlier. And then their 3rd and final meeting is scheduled for mid-September. And in the first meeting, some of the material I'll share today, we focused on kind of sharing our service levels, what we're looking to deliver, including service level inequities. And then also we focused on our funding position and the types of funding gaps that we're looking to close. So in the interest of time, I'll give you sort of just a very shortened version, key points of what we shared with the full Ballot Initiative Task Force today. And then at the second meeting, we shared information and got input about criteria for a number of potential funding options, and then walked through and reviewed those funding options themselves. And then the goal of the 3rd meeting is really to bring those 2 things together and get input from them on next steps, given their understanding, again, of both kind of the funding position and funding needs and potential funding options. The task force is a 12-member group. We have representation. Thanks again, Paul and Casey and Sabrina from the Parks Board. We have representation from the Parks Foundation, community partners, and local business owners as well. And Portlanders, we know, love their parks and recreation activities and services, but as we've previously shared with you, we're not funded at a level to fulfill our service level goals, whether operational, like taking care of our parks and natural areas and our trees, or capital, like maintaining our assets and continuing to build our system to address inequities. And we know that without additional resources, our ability to provide the services that Portlanders have really said they'll value is going to decline. So the Bureau is committed to establishing a more financially sustainable future that aligns equitable service levels and funding levels. That's why we're continuing the work, as Director Long said, of looking at potential ballot initiatives. This is an animation that shows our system's expansion by decade. So the darker gray color shows what the city of Portland boundary was in that decade. The red shows new parks that were added to the then city of Portland. And you can see that, through the decades, we have used capital bonds and operating levies to expand the park system, with the most recent 5-year operating levy passed in 2020. And our most recent bond, the $68 million replacement bond, passed in 2014. The Forest Park get added there.
The gray in the background.
Yes, I think I did mention, but the darker gray in the background is the city of Portland boundary. So for example, in the 80s and a little bit in the 90s, we see annexation of East Portland. So our most recent additions to the city. Here we are today with the system that we have. So at our first ballot initiative task force meeting, we also invited a representative from the Trust for Public Land to join us. And at that meeting, they shared a bit of research that they had done on parks funding from sort of the national perspective. So kind of among their update, I'll just share that we're unique in many ways, but we're not the only park and recreation system looking at how to appropriately resource our services through the inclusion of ballot measures. And they stated that, in their experience in over 25 years, local governments that create funding using only budget processes provide substantially less funding than those that create dedicated funding sources through ballot initiatives. And they also shared that nationally, since 1996, 76% of all parks and recreation funding measures have passed at the ballot. So voters tend to enjoy and appreciate their parks and recreation services. So I'll just share a little bit about kind of what steps we've been taking towards a sustainable future, but there's also some links and lots of additional information for those who are interested. You could go back and watch the council work session or look at any of the other resources here. But really, we began our work in 2019 after trying for many years to deliver sustainable services without sufficient resources. And some of the early steps we took back then were to create what we called at the time an alternative funding task force that met during the summer and fall of 2019. And they provided advice and consultation, kind of like the ballot initiative task force is doing now, on a variety of alternative funding options for the Bureau to consider. And then in November of 2019, we held a council work session where we reviewed sort of our financial position, our forecasts, and talked about the alternative funding options. And good news for us and the services we support at that work session, we really received very strong support from our city council to pursue additional alternative funding to change course and get the Bureau on track to actually fulfill service levels. And specifically, City Council encouraged us to continue looking at a variety of options that included income tax, the temporary levy, the formation of a special district with pursuit of a change to state statute that would allow a city council to be the governing body of a parks district, capital bonds, and a food and beverage tax. And then in early 2020, we were doing some work to advance the possibility of moving a number of those forward, but COVID happened to all of us, and it really impacted both the services we could offer and our bureau's finances with community centers shutting down. And so we pivoted pretty quickly and we pulled just two things, well, a bond that could address capital maintenance, a levy that could address the operating need. And then we actually also pulled for both together on the same ballot just to see if that could be viable. And we had both needs. And we got highest polling support for the levy. So that's what we moved forward with, referring to the November ballot. But, you know, as Director Long mentioned, while it was a critical tool and it allowed us to avoid devastating service cuts, it is temporary and it's a, you know, a 5-year option. It's not a permanent option. So we're continuing the work. We spent this past year really ramping up to be able to deliver on our voter commitments with the levy. So developing procedures, programs, partnerships, and you know, we're going to be excited to share with you all the annual report coming up this fall on how we did in year 1 of the levy. But now we're looking forward to kind of what's next on the horizon for the Parks Bureau. So to deliver critical community services, we've really focused on identifying stable revenue sources to fund 3 major categories of services for existing services. And then also we're looking at exploring new service levels like taking on street tree maintenance as well. So I'll just define these really briefly so everyone kind of knows what we're talking about as we walk through. Operations really, you know, look at equitable park and recreation programs, services, and routine daily maintenance of parks, natural areas, facilities, and trees. Capital maintenance is maintaining or replacing existing facilities, preventing asset failure, like, you know, replacing a roof or a major repair of a play structure. With capital growth, we're talking about expanding the capacity of the park system to meet the need of a growing Portland and address the many inequitable gaps that we have with access to parks, natural areas, trees, and facilities. And then I mentioned new services. So, you know, adding new services usually requires additional resources, and street tree maintenance is one new service that we are looking to explore, including sort of evaluation of the costs related to that. Is someone monitoring the chat? I see that there's a few chats that I haven't read. Was any related
No,
to
they're
this?
not.
No, okay. Perfect. Just flag for me perhaps if you see something. So this is a sort of a current picture, current fiscal year summary of where we're at in terms of the funding that we have and the funding we would need in each of these categories. We're working towards achieving a sustained annual funding level, again, in today's dollars, of about $235 million. And that would be $255 million if we also were to add street tree maintenance. So sustaining operations. To fiscal year 23, we have $139 million to deliver levy-funded levels of service, including affordable access to programs. For context, the Parks levy is providing about 1/3 of the Bureau's operating funds, about $42 million, with the other 2/3 coming from the general fund and other revenue sources. Fiscal year 26 will be the last year that we will receive those Parks levy revenues under the current voter-approved 5-year term. With capital maintenance, we project that we need $60 million a year here, and we currently receive an ongoing commitment of just under $5 million annually from the general fund. Based on a good level of investment, which would be 3% of the replacement value of our built assets. So if you think of kind of the full value of the built things that are in the park system, 3% of that, we would need $55 million more a year to be investing in our capital maintenance to really be doing sort of a good practice. The historic disinvestment in this area, you can see just how small our investments have been compared to where we need to be, has resulted in $500 million of maintenance backlog, which means assets have failed and been demolished. And we're forecasting still 1 in 5 of our assets, so our playgrounds, trails, sports courts, you name it, including buildings, would be closing in the next 15 years if we can't start to hit our target here. On the capital growth side, we actually do have a robust system development charge or SDC program. And we're forecasting that we'll continue to receive about $33 million annually from that program, which with the addition of grants and donations and additional funding in this area will enable us to continue to address inequities and close gaps in the system. More funding here could mean faster progress. And then I mentioned we are also looking at potentially funding street tree maintenance, which we anticipate would cost about $20 million a year to fund. So the biggest gap today, this year, that we see is in that capital maintenance and the backlog there that we've built up over time. This skips ahead to look 5 years from now. So this would be 1 year post the levy. And these figures are sort of inflated as well and growing with time. But here we see the operating gap open up. So if we haven't identified a successor resource or renewed the parks levy, there will be a significant operating funding gap, which will result in service declines.
Just maybe put an asterisk next to the add street tree maintenance is that has not been council directed or approved. And so that's like due diligence that we're doing on an idea that came out of 2018 work. Been discussed a bit at the task force meeting about trying to differentiate that line from the other three.
Oh, questions now or then?
I'm happy to take questions if that's okay.
Well, just because it's so obvious
That's
on,
fine.
it's okay, so obvious on that slide that there in year 5, the funding available is greatly in excess of what's needed, right, for operating. And it's almost at what's needed for maintenance. So is there any looking at sort of transferring, requesting transferring, some of this funding from operating to maintenance?
No, so
Yeah.
so we need, so what this one is showing is we have $139 million that we're going to be spending delivering all of our operating service levels that we have today.
Right.
And what this is showing is actually we need both 116 plus the 55.
Okay.
So-
read it. I got it.
So
Yeah.
unfortunately, this one is representing, we'd be cutting about a third of the services that
Right.
we're providing today.
Okay.
Yeah.
And I
I
thought,
think it's the way it's titled.
and I thought where you're going was,
Yeah.
we've thought about operating dollars and capital dollars as like two different colors of money. And so that's led us historically to like levies for operating and bonds for capital.
Right.
But you'll see in some of just the ideas we've been doing, like the desktop research on, you could flip to some other funding source that could provide you funding for both colors of money. But we've never done that much before. We've always had levy or bonds, but food and beverage tax is an example. You could get maybe all of it that you would need for both.
Okay.
I'll note Sabrina has her hand up.
Yeah.
Oh, sure. Sabrina.
I know that the street tree maintenance says 0 right now, but since that would fall under urban forestry, what is urban forestry's funding at right now? Like, what is that program's in relativity?
Yeah, and I should clarify on this one. This was looking at the city taking on the portion of street tree maintenance that is currently the responsibility of adjacent property owners. And I can't see who else raised their hand. Jen, I don't know if one of the hands raised was you and if you wanted to speak to that.
Jen had to step away.
Oh,
Dr.
okay.
Corbin. Dr. Corbin's other hand. his
Corbin
other
had her
hand
hand
up.
up though. Sabrina, did your question get answered?
No,
So,
Yeah,
I don't know if it's a question for Jen. My question is, since the street tree maintenance would go under urban forestry, what is urban forestry's funding at right now? Like, what is that program? I'm not familiar with how much funding that program has.
So
Guys, I'd have to look.
So
We can
Sabrina,
get that number to you.
currently urban forestry is not maintaining street trees. They are the responsibility of the adjacent property owner, except in the case where we've planted a street tree and we're doing that 3 years of establishment that Jen spoke about previously. We can get back to you on their overall budget. I don't have that off the top of my head. But currently that is not an area where urban forestry is working, which is why we would add that as a potential additional service.
Yeah, I understand that. I just was curious at where urban forestry is at right now. So I'll look forward to a follow-up. Thank you.
Sure.
Looks like Corbin.
Yeah, I have a question regarding, will the capital growth include land acquisition and park development and as well as increasing the number of recreation centers? Like what does that actually mean? What's the vision for capacity building?
Yeah, so this, it would include acquisition, building new parks, expanding access at existing parks, and it could include new facilities as well.
Okay, with that said, how are you measuring the capital growth with the capital maintenance and how that's going to grow together, moving as new facilities, as new land acquisition, as new parks come into play?
Yeah, so in our forecast, because the capital maintenance is 3% of the replacement value of our system, when we forecast how much growth we'll have and how much that will add to the replacement value of our system, we're building that in over time to the target of how much capital maintenance we would need. Where additionally, it doesn't just affect capital maintenance, it also affects operating, because all of those new parks or new facilities also need to have all of that daily maintenance. So we have an additional way that we're forecasting and building in how much we think we would need for that operating, or O&M, sometimes it's called. So it impacts both of those lines, the operating and capital maintenance.
Thank you. Can I ask you one more question? What is the goal of the ratio of park users or resident population to green space in Portland? Like, how would we know that we met the goal, that we have created the capacity? Because I know there are some numbers that are out there. How are you conceiving of that goal number of residents to acres in green space, or residents to the amount of recreation centers actually needed in Portland to serve the community?
So years ago, we used to have a goal that was per population, a certain amount of acres for the park system. But we recognized that as Portland is densifying, we needed to think about that in a more nuanced way. It wasn't going to be possible to, I mean, we're 15% of the city's land right now. So it wasn't going to be possible to sort of keep that same approach because there's finite land. And so with sort of the recent levels of service conversations that our planning team has led, we've started thinking about what types of experiences people need access to. And they have a number of sort of recommendations for, walkability to sort of basic access to a park or natural area, all the way to, recommendations around sports fields, sports courts, play areas, spray play, community centers. So that's kind of what we're using as our guide currently to say, if we were to build out our system to meet what the community has told us they need in terms of access, what gaps do we have and where would we be focusing on filling those gaps? But it's also a living conversation. So in the same way that we want to be continually learning and growing with our listening and learning with the community, we would want to be continually refining that and not setting something today that might not meet the needs of a population 20 or 30 years from now.
Thank you.
I just jump in real quick. Sabrina, I've got your answer. We basically have like 3 program areas for urban forestry. One is tree maintenance, where the requested budget for 21-22 is about $9.7 million. Tree regulation, about $2.9 million. And urban forestry science and outreach was about $900,000. And I'll just put a second asterisk on that line. The 21 million estimate is based on contractors doing the work, not city staff. So that's the consultant came up that number with using a number based on contracted labor.
Thank you.
Sure.
I don't think there's any other hands up.
Doesn't look like it.
So this next slide showing current year and year 5, the same information that we looked at, but this is in chart form. So in this chart, solid colors indicate that available funding, and kind of the dash or hash marks indicate the order of magnitude of the funding gap. So you can kind of see the relationship between them just in a different way. And here I've also brought in year 15. So, you know, to your point, Corbin, you can see a little bit the relationship of some of these numbers over time. As we continue to grow out our system, that's going to increase that capital maintenance need and the operational need. So, you know, when we look at the timing, this is kind of a 5-year window. We have that deferred maintenance backlog, $500 million that we've grown over time that's resulted in failing assets today. We have a need for about $55 million in additional capital maintenance resources to be able to invest at that good practice 3% of kind of the value of the system that we maintain, the built system. And then we also have, you know, by year 5 or before year 5, when the levy would expire, we need to address that operating gap that's going to show up. So we need a successor resource or a renewal plan for the levy.
Sarah.
Oh, yeah.
So just a quick question that I think to help contextualize how big that $500 million number is if I'm doing my math right, if 3% of our portfolio value is 55 million, that means the portfolio is worth about 1.6, 1.7.
Yep.
So fully a third of the value of our portfolio is in need of maintenance.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
That's a great point.
Well, or actually probably more close, like, or an area for
A third of
condition.
it is, yeah, is overdue.
Okay.
Right. So probably 1.5 billion needs maintenance.
Gotcha. Okay, but I'm to get us out of the deferred.
500 million
backlog.
is, it's at end of life or some major
That's-
failures about to happen.
That's helpful. Thanks.
Yeah.
All right, so, is it okay, Bonnie, if we keep going? Are we good on time? Yep, okay. Great, well then I wanted to spend a little bit of time. I didn't know if we'd have enough time today, so I think this wasn't in the packet that I sent out to all of you, but I can follow up with this additional information. So I wanna spend a little bit of time looking at potential funding options that we've looked at, and we've grouped them just into 3 basic categories. So, you know, fees and other sources, property taxes, and then other specific non-property taxes. And just generally, fees are, you know, something we would collect in exchange for a service that we're offering, like a fee for a class or a permit, or like in the case of system development charges for a development impact. And then, you know, fees are really intended to kind of like recoup the cost of that's being incurred while we're providing that service. Taxes, on the other hand, are, you know, levied more broadly for the purpose of raising revenues for more general public benefits. So, you know, property taxes, the arts tax, business income taxes. I'm going to not sort of like walk through in great depth each of these, but this is, you know, this is the list of a number of fees and other non-tax revenues that we looked at. Many of these we have used before. Some of these would be new and haven't been used by Parks yet. They're definitely all tools that we would continue pursuing and using, but on their own, these aren't tools that we see being able to fill kind of the order of magnitude of our funding gaps. And, you know, system development charges, I will flag, that is the one where, as I mentioned, we are gonna, you know, forecast continuing getting significant revenues here, but they are, we think, you know, at cost recovery and fully being utilized for their intended purpose of capital growth. So these are all great tools. We'll continue pursuing them, but we don't think that these tools on their own are going to get us there and close the funding gaps that we need. So we need to look at other alternatives. Sure. Yes, sorry. Adam.
Yeah, this is just sort of tangential. Thanks so much for putting this together. On the last slide for fee or other, is there a precedent, or maybe Director Long, or you know, maybe this is a question for you, but is there any precedent on earned revenue from Parks from like large scale sports tourism?
We charge permit fees. However, we don't have those kind of tournament bumper agreements.
Okay.
Sport Oregon works with Travel Portland and crafts a lot of those types of agreements, and they get a small amount from Travel Portland to do kind of sport tourism. So, you know, capturing some of that revenue that coming off hotels or,
Right.
you know, things. So historically, Parks hasn't done that. But there are some other jurisdictions. Tukwila is a large sports facility,
Right.
and I think the city and the facility kind of take a piece of hotel rentals, stuff like that.
Okay, so if I'm understanding that correctly, Parks is generally out of that equation for the most part.
Yeah, we have.
Except for the permit.
Except for the permit, got it, okay.
Yeah, we haven't.
Okay.
But it's another idea out there that you probably get some increment. Right?
Yeah, it wouldn't be enough,
Right.
yeah. Thanks.
But all ideas are good ideas.
That's right.
All good ideas.
That's $500,000, that's great.
Yeah.
So before we sort of dive into the other property tax and specific tax options, I want to spend a little bit of time on the criteria that we might use to consider on them. So we listed a number of criteria here, but I would also love your input on if there's additional criteria that you think we should be looking at. Just briefly, I'll go over these. So allowable use, you know, we looked at if things could be used for operating expenses, capital maintenance, capital growth, or like all areas of our funding need. With duration, we looked at whether something might be like a permanent funding source, if it's a temporary funding source like our 5-year levy, or even, you know, a one-time funding source. With funding potential, we looked at how much annual revenue we think it could raise, and kind of generally categorize them with like things that had high revenue potential being over $15 million annually. With who pays, we looked at, you know, is it individuals, is it businesses, certain types of businesses, and, you know, this is also, I think, where we want to have a conversation with the task force in their next meeting about whether something might be more regressive, which means, you know, somebody with less means might be paying a higher percentage, not necessarily a higher overall amount, but a higher percentage relative to their means, or more progressive, so those with higher means are paying a higher percentage. A couple of the funding sources we'll look at also involve compression. So that means that other jurisdictions could lose revenues. And so we can flag where that comes into play. We also looked at like who would approve it. So you know, is it something city council could approve, or does it need to go to voters? We also looked at how easy it might be to collect. So sometimes we might have a mechanism already in place that can collect it. In other cases, we might need to set up like a whole entire system, not only to collect it, but also, I think, Aaron, you brought up this point in the financial sustainability working group, you know, how easy it would be for someone to pay it as well. In many cases, you know, we looked at some historic actuals from other jurisdictions to get a sense of, you know, an annual growth rate for the revenue source, and similarly, using, you know, historic actuals from other jurisdictions, got a sense of how volatile they were, and generally categorize those as, you know, high volatility were things where we saw standard deviations of 5% or higher. And, you know, we also tried to go back as far as possible to see not just how COVID impacted things, but like the 2008-9 recession as well. But some of these funding sources that we'll look at, there actually wasn't that long of a history of jurisdictions using them. So we went back as far as we could. And I would love to get thoughts on criteria, but Bonnie, is this a good place to pause for public comment?
Yeah, thanks, Sarah. I just wanted to pause because we do have time set aside for public comment. I wanted to verify nobody has logged in from the public who wanted to comment. See anyone? Okay. With that, Corbin did post a question to the chat. Corbin, do you want to ask it, or you want me to just read it for you?
I can ask it. The question is a sales tax possible, although not popular, like our park penny sales tax, or a situation where people, instead of getting change, they can choose to donate it to Parks and Rec instead of having, you know, 2 pennies or something like that? Like, how unconventional are you willing to go for these strategies, I guess, is my question.
Yeah, I think I don't know about the latter, so I mean, I think anything where someone's voluntarily donating could work, if we put the mechanism in place. You'll see on the next slide, we did look at like food and beverage tax. We also looked at like a sugary soda tax, so certain types of sales taxes. So it could be possible, yeah.
I just put in my little slogan, change for parks, so.
I'll just note that we tried to just open up a window without a lot of marketing, but just a prompt on the registration to take donations from folks that were registering for our programs and had very low response. It wasn't like the roundup idea like you have there, but yeah.
I'm thinking like at grocery stores and convenience
Sure.
stores, that sort of thing.
Yeah, yeah.
I like it. Are there any other criteria? So these are sort of the things that we've been looking at to date, but anything else that folks think they're not seeing on the list that you think would be really important to consider?
So it may be implied in there, but just winnability. I'm curious of the 75% of the 75%, of these things that have gotten passed in prior times, which are the most winning mechanisms and for what? I mean, I would guess that it's likely that new services are much sexier than maintenance. And so it may be harder to get these passed for maintenance and ability for operating for new parks. So anyway.
Yeah, I feel like we had some version of that comment at the task force as well, and kind of related to winnability might be whether that there would be likelihood of organized opposition. So normally our measures have not had any organized opposition. So it's really about just open fields, doing public information.
Just kind of, just related to that, the word I heard a lot was saturation. That people are feeling so taxed now in Multnomah County that they're moving out. Businesses are, people are. So I don't know if that's really a criteria, but saturation is certainly an issue that's coming.
Corbin has her hand up.
Oh, Corbin.
I guess my follow-up question would be, especially around this idea of the infrastructure bill, how much work has been put into understanding Parks and Rec as a crucial infrastructure, which everybody's been saying over the last couple of years related to COVID, but are we looking at any possibility of that infrastructure money coming to Parks and Rec? Or is that something that we still need to build a case for?
She's referring to the
I mean,
federal.
existing funding sources like local.
Existing, upcoming, anything around infrastructure. Unfortunately, when we think about infrastructure, we're thinking usually about the built environment and not necessarily about parks.
Well, there's the EDA trail program, which, I mean,
Yeah, we've been pursuing federal funding that has been made available in response to COVID, and we've been to some degree successful and in others not so much. Including receiving ARPA funding, but not a very large amount.
Yeah, so at least in our recent history, it's mostly on a project by project basis. Yeah. And so, it's a lot of time and effort depending on the process to even put in just one application. So then you're looking for projects that are multi-million-dollar or bigger. And so from the capital set aside account, correct me if I'm wrong, but major maintenance, extra money, about $30 million over the last 5 years. We've got through the city process. So every year we're kind of competing against other city bureaus, mostly PBOT, sometimes some other bureaus, to get that capital set aside money, which is the carryover funds of every fiscal year. Half of them go to that. And then as Adina said, we just got $15 million from the state because there's community support for Columbia Pool, or we'll go after federal grants and other opportunities. That goes back, I think, to the page before of that will get us tens of millions of dollars while we fall behind that much every year. So it's not a catch-up game, you know, that source, but it's an important one that we actually have dedicated staff. That's mostly what they do.
And I guess one of my concerns is that a lot of folks don't realize that, and they just did it like maybe a year ago, did a study that usually they look at Parks and Rec as the first budget to cut in any sort of city crisis. And so having independent financing or funding is really crucial. And I don't know how well the population is educated regarding that.
At least in the moment, we have a commitment from the city council to be treated just like other general fund bureaus. And so we will not be cut for operating funds in comparison to other general fund bureaus. And we got that commitment because of the Parks levy. So.
Great, thank you.
Yeah.
So I wanted to share some of the next steps that we'll be doing. We have the ballot initiative task force is going to have their third meeting in mid-September. And then I would love to come back to this group to give an update potentially at your October meeting, if that works with your agenda, so we can share some of those next steps with you as well. I was planning on it if we had the time, and I think we don't have the time, just looking at that clock here, to actually kind of walk through each of these and talk a little bit about each of them with using the lens of like the criteria that we just looked at. So I'll do a higher level here, just so everybody's aware. So there were 3 property taxes that we looked at. So bond is one of them, and again, that's kind of, you set a dollar amount that you know you're going to raise. And so those really, those have varying revenue potential depending on what we would put forward. Temporary local option levy, so renewal of the levy is definitely something that remains an option. We also looked at special districts, which are unique of everything in this list in that they can be passed and set up with a maximum rate, so kind of like almost like a permanent levy rate. But they also are an independent governance structure. So right now under Oregon state law, a special district couldn't be governed by a Portland City Council. It could be governed if it was within one county by a county commission or by an independently elected board. But in the 2019 work session, commissioners shared concern about that and a desire to have us look into actually changing the Oregon statute so that a city council could be a governing body, which is really similar to what they did in the state of Washington. They allowed a city council to be the governing body. And after they did that, Seattle passed a park district that has the Seattle City Council as their governing body. Corbin, you asked, are we sort of open to ideas out of the box? So hopefully some of these might be a little out of the box. You know, we had previously looked at transient lodging and cell phone. They both have around $7 million of revenue potential annually, but for various reasons, City Council wasn't as keen on us continuing to pursue those. Food and beverage, prepared food and beverage, this is non-alcoholic beverage, does have pretty significant revenue potential, over $90 million a year. So some other jurisdictions in Oregon have successfully passed those. Council asked us to consider an income tax, and so we did, you know, some modeling around, especially like a high earner income tax of the top 2% of earners in Portland, and that could also generate significant income. Amusement tax is maybe the most wild card on the list. Exists in Illinois, so Chicago has it and Cook County has it. But Chicago's is unique because it's not only a tax on like sports games, theater, in-person amusements, but also digital. So that they're actually bringing in significant revenue from like Netflix, Spotify, online gaming. So anyone consuming digital amusements is paying a 9% tax. So that could, just scaling it to Portland, maybe raise, you know, $46 million a year. To Todd's earlier point though, some of these are going to have probably pretty strong opposition. We also looked at payroll, which, you know, payroll tax could be something to consider. There might be a bit of jurisdictional overlap with TriMet's payroll tax that we would need our city attorneys to look into further for us. on that one. Capital gains was another one, so that would be capital gains on things like, automobiles, stocks, bonds, jewelry. The one area of capital gains that we would be preempted from being able to use is the real estate capital gains, and that's the bottom one that we looked at. Seattle, about 16% of their budget is funded by real estate excise tax, but we cannot do that in Oregon currently. And we also looked at a sweetened beverage or soda tax. So those are in a group of taxes that are kind of sometimes called a sin tax. So the idea is you're trying to like curb the unhealthy behavior, and you could use the revenues towards healthy things like parks and community gardens and all the wonderful things we provide.
The problem is the more successful you are, the
more
less money
successful-
you
That's
have.
right. So Berkeley, California, I think their sales of sweetened beverages dropped 10% in the first year that their tax went into. So it is a declining growth rate potentially on that tax. But these are the ones that we have initially had a conversation with the task force about introducing them in the last meeting, and then we'll talk more in their next meeting. All right, well, I think that was more than my time. I appreciate the extra time, Bonnie.
Thank you, Sarah. Any last questions for Sarah? I wanted to just check in with you guys. We are looking at potentially having our next meeting at the Community Music Center. They're not fully set up to have hybrid like this because they don't have a projected screen situation. But we're hoping to give it a try and see how it works. If nobody has objections. So we will have an option to Zoom. Well, I guess it will be call-in because we don't have a screen there.
Yeah, well, it will probably just be laptop situation.
Right,
so, yeah.
which will be impossible to hear, I can attest, because I tried to have one of those. I was the virtual person and couldn't hear anything.
Yeah, we'll probably have to do a Polycom or something.
So, so I just wanted to check in with you on that. And if anybody has feedback on that, please send it to me and Casey. And if you have any specific agenda suggestions for upcoming meetings as well, we have a few things in our parking lot, as well as things that we always seem to run out of time on. But if there's anything else, please let me know. Erin.
Oh, do you want us to email those, or we have 2 minutes?
We have 2 minutes. You can email them to me, or you can shout them out.
Yeah, no, I have a few. First is last board meeting, we talked about having a meeting devoted to priority setting. Is that next meeting, or when is that coming?
Yeah, that's one of the things that we've been talking about. I think it's also related to when Casey and the Board Affairs Working Group have a chance to actually process that stuff, to be able to, so that we can devote and have a meaningful conversation about that.
Okay, it'd just be good to get an update since we did talk about wanting that as a board. The other thing is I'd love to have a continued conversation around cooling and warming shelters that we talked about. I'm a little concerned with the idea of the Friends of Trees, which is a very public conversation right now, moving to a working group where we're not in a public meeting. So, I mean, I think it's okay, but I would prefer to have more opportunity for conversation in the public meeting setting around that. And then I would personally prefer the agendas to have more opportunity for robust conversations versus just providing feedback on updates. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, I think, the intent to have the land use and infrastructure working group address that was not to get it out of the public meeting setting, but to be able to delve further into issues. But we will certainly have full board meetings on that topic as well. And I guess I'm interested in hearing from people, because a challenge that we have is when we do send the reports out, not everybody reads them truthfully. And I get that it can be frustrating for people who do read it, which maybe is an incentive to them to not read it, which I think is super challenging. But I agree, I would love to have more robust conversation as a full board, and want people to have time to do that. But we also do have the information we want to get out. We want to strike a balance there. So please, I think the degree to which we can continue to push that a little bit away from reports out and more just devote that time to questions. And maybe if the working group chairs can have that in mind, to keep your report short and put most of the substantive information in your written report, that would be great. And also Randy. Randy, looks like he signed off, so I
No, he's
will.
not here.
Space, so.
Oh.
I'm sorry, what was the question? I got a little distracted.
No, he wasn't there.
No, not a question. We were just talking about truncating where possible report out so that we can spend more time
Oh,
having
yeah, I
discussion.
got that part.
Okay.
Yeah.
That'd be great. Sorry, I was looking and then I didn't see it. So yeah, but that's something we can move in that direction, totally. All right, anything else? Okay. If not, we will adjourn. Thank you. We'll see you next month at the Community Music Center or virtually.
Thank
Or,
you.
I guess, on the conference call. Thank you. Bye.
Yeah.